Hello everyone. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Some Key Concepts in the Fundamental Teachings of Theravada Buddhism. I'm sure all of you know Shakespeare's Hamlet, and probably you remember the scene where Polonius, a courtier and the servant of the king, approaches Hamlet and asks what he's reading. What do you read, my lord? And Hamlet answers, words, words, words. And this conversation can be interpreted in many ways, which is quite normal for Shakespeare. But a possible interpretation is that words are superficial, they can't grab or describe reality properly, they can only scratch the surface of things, but they can't, so to say, penetrate into deeper reality. And when studying Buddhism, you may be tempted to think that words are not important at all, because after all, we want to get closer to some external and internal reality, whatever that may be. And yes, it is true for certain parts of human experience that they cannot be described with words. This is a fact, there's nothing mysterious about it. It simply comes from the fact that human language is intended to cover certain aspects of human experience. But there are some parts, some spheres of the human world which cannot be covered by human language. But does this mean that we have to throw away words completely, that language is completely useless? Of course not. By the way, at this point, let me remind you that Buddhism doesn't like extremes. It prefers a common sense-based approach, a middle way, so-called Majjhima Patipada, between the two extremes. So when you study Buddhism, words are very important and extremely useful, provided that you are aware of their limitations. So let me cite a well-known metaphor about moon and the finger pointing to the moon. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon itself. So words are not equal to meaning, but they are important to convey some message or some meaning. So words can open up a gate to the Buddha's Dharma or the Buddha's teachings. But at the same time, you must understand that words are not ends in themselves. But it is important as much as possible to try and avoid misunderstandings when it comes to the basic concepts and words, terms, technical terms of Buddhism. So this is why I want to deal with the Buddhist terms in my presentation, because I think that is very important, especially for those who are starting to deal with Buddhism. So for those who are interested in Buddhism but are in an initial phase of studying it. In my presentation, I'm going to cite from the Pali Canon and from the Dhammapada. This is a Pali text as well, and also from modern authors to try and illustrate my message. My presentation is broken down into 5 to 10 minute long blocks, each concentrating on a specific word. Some words are well known, such as dukkha, karma, nibbana, or Buddha. Some are less well known, such as Karuna or metta. And in the end of my presentation, you will find a list of the books and the sources I am referring to in my presentation. So these are the books I recommend for everyone who wants to have a deeper understanding into these basic terms I'm going to discuss. Our first word is dukkha. Surprisingly, I will not start with the first word which comes into everyone's mind, namely Buddha. I talk about the Buddha or the person called Buddha later, but at this point first I'm going to concentrate on the single key point of Buddha's teachings, and this is dukkha. And the Buddha, when he wanted to give the summary of all his teachings in a single sentence, he said that I teach suffering, dukkha, and the end of suffering, the end of dukkha. And I think that if a great philosopher or religious thinker is willing to give a very short summary, very concise, one-sentence summary of all his teachings, then you have to listen, because that's very important. That sentence is very important. So I teach suffering and the end of suffering. But what is this suffering? What is this dukkha? It's not that easy to define, because it covers a huge category, and this category contains lots and lots of individual, subjective human experiences. You might have heard about the basic teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, and dukkha is the first one of them. And sometimes it is translated as existence is suffering, which at the first glance, at least to me, seems to be a somewhat exaggerated declaration. After all, I don't suffer all the time, you don't suffer all the time, I think. Normally we live a human life which is a mixture of positive and negative emotions, feelings, impressions. Sometimes we experience suffering, but sometimes there are nice, contented moments filled with love, happiness, inspiration. And of course these moments alternate with moments of sadness or depression, but still we have this specific mixture of human experiences. Anyway, I myself wouldn't say that existence in its entirety is suffering, because in my opinion our very experience seems to contradict this declaration. So at this point we need to understand what suffering or dukkha exactly means. So this is a Pali word, so if you check it out in Rhys David's Pali English dictionary, I'm not going to read out the article, but it's a very long 10-line definition of the word, and at the same time it's not really an English word for dukkha, but a long explanation for the shortcomings of all the possible English renderings, all possible English terms and translations. So if you open up a dictionary and you see that you don't find a neat Pali word and a neat English word next to it, but a long explanation, you need to understand that there is some kind of problem trying to understand, trying to translate this specific word. And most probably this comes from the fact that the Pali language and the English language, the source language and the target language, differ from each other. And this is due to the fact that certain linguists, for instance Eugene Nida, say languages segment reality into small parts, smaller parts. And this segmentation, this specific way of segmentation is different from language to language, which means that when we use a language, we break up the world into smaller concepts, and then we denote these concepts with words. This is what segmentation is. But every language is different, works with smaller or bigger segments. And this is why it may happen that certain languages have some words which we can understand, but we cannot give a proper translation in another language. So a good example for that is the Portuguese word saudade, which has a very specific exact meaning about, and basically it concerns some kind of longing for something or someone who is not, or what is not there, probably doesn't even exist. So some very specific sad feeling, and this is a very exact meaning. But if you want to say it in English, we need to give a lengthy definition of it, because we don't have a specific English word for that. And this is what happens when we try to translate the Pali word dukkha into English. And if I say suffering, then I feel that I simply limit the range of meaning of the word dukkha, because dukkha covers the whole scale of human experience, from very fierce, very severe physical or mental suffering to these slight, uneasiness or discomfort, or from sadness, very deep sadness on the one extreme, to the vague feeling of some discontent, the feeling that something is wrong, something is missing. Let me cite Shakespeare again, and I think this is what Hamlet refers to when he says that the time is out of joint. And for me, this is the most exact definition of dukkha, of the word dukkha. It simply says that we feel, or the human being feels, that the world is not as it should be, things never seem to be quite all right, perfect or balanced. Something is always missing. And I think this is perfectly illustrated with the etymological origin of the word dukkha. There are various theories about the origin of the word, but one of the theories say that the word dukkha comes from two roots. One is du, which means bad, and the other is ka, which means the axle hole of a wheel. Now, the axle hole of a wheel is the tiny hole in the middle of the wheel where the axle of a cart goes into. Just imagine a cart. You have, of course, the body of a cart, the axle, and the wheels, the four wheels. Now, what happens if the axle hole of a wheel is not exactly in the middle? Then you start riding that cart, and you will have a bumpy ride, because as the wheel turns, the cart starts going rough. So this is being out of joint. This is dukkha. This is the human condition. And let me cite the Buddha, more specifically his first speech, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief and despair are suffering, association with the loathed is suffering, dissociation from the loved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. And he could go on and on and on, and now I think you have some basic understanding of the word dukkha. And mark that the Buddha doesn't say that existence as a whole in its entirety is suffering, but points out that there is dukkha. Dukkha does exist. There is this uneasiness or lack of balance or imperfection or unsatisfactoriness or stress or discontent which impregnates human life, which is present in every moment of human life. And I think this declaration or claim is something that is acceptable for all of us, for the most of us. It seems more rational to me than saying that existence is suffering. And this is the noble truth of suffering, the core of the Buddha's teaching, the Dhamma. However, if the Buddha's teachings stopped here, I would say that we should go out and have a nice cup of coffee somewhere on a sunny terrace or somewhere, instead of studying Buddhism, because there's no point in making a diagnosis and then stopping. So let me remind you that this is only the starting point. This is only the first noble truth of the Four Noble Truths, and it is actually a diagnosis of where we are. And traditionally, the Buddha is often compared to a doctor or a physician, and his teachings are compared to a process of healing or treatment, or medical treatment to be more precise. The first noble truth is the diagnosis, the starting point. Let's see if there is a problem or not. And of course, as you know, the Buddha says that yes, there is a problem, namely suffering or dukkha. And as Valpola Rahula points out, diagnosis is very important. If a doctor is over-optimistic or over-pessimistic, the patient dies. The doctor needs to be realistic. He needs to understand the reality as it is, and to give a proper diagnosis, and then the patient survives. Now, the Buddha is like a doctor. He doesn't hide the fact that we are ill, but he doesn't stop at this point, but goes further. He checks out the cause of disease, and this takes us to the second noble truth, namely the origin of dukkha, which is tanha in Pali, which means thirst. Metaphorically, it means desire or attachment. And this is the second noble truth called samudaya, which is about the origin of suffering. The second noble truth says that the origin of suffering is thirst or attachment, and it's important because it makes us understand that dukkha doesn't happen randomly, just by itself or spontaneously, but it does have a cause. Mind you that as far as tanha or craving or attachment is concerned, we must understand that it can be positive and negative, both positive and negative. By that I mean that it can take the form of desire, and also it can take the form of hatred or the impulse to try and avoid something. Again, tanha ranges from a fierce desire to get something to weak, unconscious stirs of will on the other extreme, or from deep hatred or fierce hatred to slight discontent. So again, it's a very big scale of human experiences. So that was the second noble truth. The third noble truth, which is the third step of the process, is where the Buddha seeks to establish whether this disease or dukkha or suffering can be cured or not. Unfortunately, his answer is yes, and it's very simple, very logical. If you eliminate the cause of suffering, namely tanha or attachment, then you can regain your health and you can eliminate the consequence, namely dukkha. So if you eliminate thirst or tanha, you won't experience dukkha or suffering anymore, and that is the third noble truth. And the fourth step is the fourth noble truth, which gives us a very detailed explanation of what to do practically. I mean, what to do in real life to be able to get rid of suffering, to get rid of attachment. And it describes the Noble Eightfold Path, Arya Attangika Magga in Pali. And this Noble Eightfold Path is a way of living which will eventually lead us to the end of suffering. And the 8 limbs or elements of this Noble Eightfold Path do not constitute a sequence. It doesn't mean that I have to develop the first element, which is samadhi or right view, to the very perfection and practice it to the very perfection, as I said. And then you can skip to the second element of the Noble Eightfold Path. But we have to practice all these factors at the same time together, because they develop together as an organic whole and they help each other develop at the same time. So this is how the Buddha offers all those interested with a practical way of living, which may help us to lead a harmonious way, a harmonious life, and at the same time have meaningful relations with other human beings and other beings. Our second word is the Buddha. You may have noticed that I use the expression the Buddha instead of Buddha. Why is that? Because the Buddha is not a personal name, but rather marks the status of being awakened, being enlightened. That is a person who managed to step out of the usual way of the operation of the human being and switched into a smoother, more natural and happier mode of existence or being. Now, a key message of Buddhism is that everyone can make this shift. Everyone can become a Buddha, because this is a potential in all human beings. We can achieve enlightenment, we can understand the world around us clearly without any distortion, with deep wisdom, and we can live in freedom, and we can live in meaningful relations with others. This also means that the Buddha did not say he was a god or the son of a god, or a messenger or prophet of a god, or he was inspired by a god. He simply was a human being who used his spiritual capacities to the maximum extent possible, and by his example showed us a way, or showed a way to all who are interested in putting an end to suffering. So the Buddha does not expect anyone to believe him or to follow his teachings. He simply offers an opportunity, and it's up to each individual to decide if he or she wants to follow the Buddha's path. And what's more, the Buddha even urged his followers to doubt his teachings. In the Karuna Sutta, for instance, lay people approach him saying that many spiritual teachers arrive in their town and claim to have the absolute truth. So each spiritual teacher claimed to have the absolute truth. And these poor lay people want to know how they can decide if a teaching is right or wrong. And the Buddha's answer is very simple. He says that these lay people should decide on the basis of the consequences of the teachings. If a teaching reduces greed or hatred and ignorance, that is, reduces the usual contaminations of the human mind, then it's a good teaching. It should be followed. If it reduces the suffering of all human beings, then it should be followed. But if it increases suffering and increases the contamination of the human mind, then it should be discarded, because that's not a good teaching. So importantly, the Buddha points out that nothing should be accepted as it is, or at face value, so to say, simply because a teacher or even the Buddha himself says it. As the Buddha says in the Karuna Sutta, we should not accept something simply because we heard it repeatedly, because tradition holds it, or, and I quote the Buddha here, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is in a scripture, nor upon another's seeming ability, nor upon the consideration the monk is our teacher. Kalamas, when you yourself know these things are bad, these things are blamable, these things lead to harm and ill, then abandon them. So let me repeat that nor upon the consideration the monk is our teacher. So this means that even if the Buddha says something, you should not accept it simply because the Buddha says it, but you should rely on your own common sense. That's a very important teaching of the Buddha. And again, let me point out that extremes should be avoided again. Healthy amount of doubt is necessary, but it can turn into excessive, unproductive doubt, which can paralyze us. So in that case, doubt qualifies as one of the 5 hindrances, and it is called vicikicca. So excessive, barren or unproductive doubt is a hindrance which you may face while you are trying to progress on this spiritual path. Again, the point is to try and find a middle way between the two extremes, between blind faith on the one hand and excessive doubt on the other hand. And this middle way or middle path is trust, which in Pali is called sattha. I heard a very accurate simile about sattha, about this initial trust, so to say, and unfortunately I forgot who told me this simile, so I can't remember the source, but I think it's a very, very good example. So let's say that I'm walking around in London and I'm looking for the closest metro station, and but I can't find it, and suddenly I see a woman who seems to be nice, seems to know the place, and I just go to her and ask her how to get to the metro station, and then she gives me the directions, and go straight and take the second street on the left, etc., and the metro station will be there. And what do I do? Do I fall on my knees in front of her and start worshipping her, telling her, "Thank you, Master, for sharing with me this highest and absolute truth about the location of this metro station, and you are the one and only Master"? So do I do that? No, I simply thank her and thinking that she looks reliable, and I go and try the direction she gave me and try and find the metro station. So this is healthy trust, this is sattha, this is an initial trust which you need if you want to start walking on the Buddhist path. I would say that sattha is an interest or a specific amount of trust which is enough to inspire you to go on and see for yourself. Because Buddhism is called ehipassika in Pali, which translates into English as come and see. Our third term or word is Dhamma. Dhamma is the Pali version of Sanskrit Dharma, which denotes the Buddha's teaching, the corpus of all the Buddha's teachings. And Dhamma is often translated as truth or law with capital T and capital L, which shows that this system is meant to describe the world as it is, or to give an exact account of its operation. So Dhamma is a practical tool whose purpose is to help you out of suffering, because if you remember, the Buddha says that he teaches dukkha and the end of dukkha. So it's very logical that this body of teachings, although held in deep respect by Buddhists, is not a sacred system that should be worshipped by itself. So Dhamma is not an end on its own. In a well-known simile in the Alagaddupama Sutta, the Buddha compares his teachings or the Dhamma to a raft, to a makeshift boat, which is useful when it transports you from one bank of the river to the other bank. And according to the simile, the near shore or the near bank, the bank you are standing on is dangerous, and the other side of the river, other bank of the river is safe. So you make this boat or raft and you paddle through, and the question is, what do you do with the raft once you get to the other shore? And the Buddha's answer is quite simple, that once you have crossed over, you should simply leave the raft, leave the teachings behind. So as the Buddha says, and I quote him, "In the same way, monks, I have taught the Dhamma compared to a raft, for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of holding on to." The fourth word is Sangha, community, and it's related to the words Buddha and Dhamma, because Sangha, Buddha and Dhamma make up the three jewels or Tiratana. Buddhists, as they say, take refuge in these three jewels, stating that amid all this suffering and problems and dukkha, up and downs of everyday life, they trust in the Buddha, they trust in the Dhamma, and they trust in Sangha. The Buddha, in this sense, is the human capacity to achieve enlightenment. Dhamma is the teaching, is the corpus of the teachings of the Buddha, and Sangha is the community of everyone who share the same spiritual goal. Sangha can be the monastic community of monks and nuns, or more extensively, Sangha can be the community of all human beings who aspire for spiritual development, all who want to achieve Buddhahood. The next fifth word is Kamma, and it's a very interesting word. I'm sure everyone heard it in non-Buddhist context, although probably in its Sanskrit form, karma. Now, in these non-Buddhist contexts, in everyday use, kamma or karma often means or usually means fate or destiny or some hidden will or power of the universe or some message sent by the universe to me. So in the English language and in the Hungarian language too, we have a word which has a very specific, clearly defined meaning in the field of Buddhism. This is a technical term, so to say. And then we have the same word in colloquial, everyday use with a vague, mystical, even esoteric range of meanings and connotations. So we have the same word, but in different contexts with different meanings. So in such cases, I think that it's very important to so to say, forget about the colloquial meaning of the word karma or kamma, especially when dealing with Buddhism, and try and stick to the precise Buddhist meaning. Now, kamma is a key concept which defines the Buddhist approach to life, the Buddhist outlook, and as well as the Buddhist ethical system. The word itself means action, so it's very simple, act or deed, but it's very important to understand that it refers only to intentional action or deed. So mark also that kamma does not denote the consequences of such an act, because that would be denoted by the Pali word upaka. The Buddhist teaching on kamma is very simple and straightforward, because it simply says that if you do or say or think something intentionally, then you are bound to experience some kind of consequence of that action. And the nature of the consequence or the effect will be defined by the nature of the original action. To put it simply, if you have a seed, you plant it and then it grows and starts bringing fruits, then the nature of the fruits will be defined by the nature of the seed. So this is a summary of the teaching of kamma, cause and effect. And at this point, let me cite the Dhammapada, which says, phenomena are preceded by the heart, ruled by the heart, made of the heart. If you speak or act with a corrupted heart, then suffering follows you, as the wheel of the cart, the track of the ox that pulls it. Heart is another possible translation for chitta, which can also be translated into English as mind. So when you hear heart, think about heart and mind, or mind. Phenomena are preceded by the heart, ruled by the heart, made of the heart. If you speak or act with a calm, bright heart, then happiness follows you like a shadow that never leaves. So this is the end of the passage from the Dhammapada. And another important point about kamma and its effects is that the consequence of one's acts are non-transferable. It cannot be given to someone else, which means that no one can save you from the consequences of your own actions. As the Buddha says, I am the owner of my actions, my kamma, heir to my actions, born of my actions. And sometimes the cause and effect relationship between action and consequence is very evident, very easy to see, because the effect is immediate and clearly related to the original act or action. But sometimes the operation of the law of kamma, of cause and effect, may take a long time, and if you believe in rebirth, then you may say that it may take more than one lifetime. Buddhism holds that only the Buddhas or enlightened beings can see clearly the operation of kammic causes and effects in the finest detail, and the whole system is highly intricate and complex, and the system is almost impossible to understand even for the actions of a single human being. And human beings are interrelated persons and not discrete entities scattered over space, which means that our kamma and its consequences intertwined with the karma of others. And even if we don't understand the whole system, even if we don't understand the universe as a whole, everything boils down to a very simple universal rule or law of ethics. And again, let me quote the Dhammapada: "All tremble at violence, life is dear to all. Putting oneself in the place of another, one should not kill nor cause another to kill." And the key point is here, putting oneself in the place of another, or to rephrase it, which is with a quotation from the Bible, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And not surprising that we find so similar declarations in the Dhammapada, in the Bible, because this is a universal human ethical consideration for the followers of any religion and for atheist people alike. You probably remember that I said that karma is action. Action you perform when you do or say or think something intentionally. And I won't go at this point into details about bodily acts and verbal acts, because I think those are very easy to understand. But I think the intentional act by thinking, or intentional mental act, is an interesting point, and I would like to discuss it. Buddhism knows about so-called 3 gates or media via which a human being acts. These are the 3 gates of karma. And the third one, beside body and speech, is mind or thinking, which may be somewhat surprising for you. Does it mean that when I have a fleeting thought or emotion or of irritation, let's say, it counts as a bad karma? Of course not, because it is intention that matters. So an intentional act of mind is when, let's say, I have a thought of irritation or an angry thought, it appears in my mind, and I, instead of letting it go, letting it follow its natural course, which is existence and then disappearance, I grab it, rethink it over and over again, and dwell on past experiences, projects, hopes or fears for the future, etc. So this is intentional thinking. This is how, out of a very basic, simple and short-lived thought or impression, so to say, I create a complete and very complex structure. This is intentional thinking. And it's easy to understand the effects or the consequences of such an act of thinking. If in a specific situation I behave, or in this case think or feel in a specific way, in this case negatively, with hatred, then in the next similar situation my mind will more easily, so to say, slip into that mode of operation. And the whole process continues, it strengthens itself, corroborates itself. And this is how this way of thinking becomes a mental rut I click into in every similar situation. So the bad consequence is that I need to live and relate to others with that kind of mental setup. And let's not forget about the fact that physical action, speech and thought are not cannot be separated from each other completely. They are interrelated. So if the operation of my mind is determined by irritation or hatred, then most probably it will turn into speech and finally into actions in the long run. So as you can see, the law of karma is nothing personal. It's not about some kind of God or some kind of being, an absolute being. It's not about reward or punishment. The law of karma operates very simply, like a law of nature, for instance gravity. If you do something, then you will experience the results in some form. And at this point, let me remind you that we should avoid an extreme interpretation of the law of karma, according to which karma is like a machine, like a clockwork-like mechanism, where the same act always brings about the same consequence, the same result, because this is not true. The doer or the conditions of the act are just as important. So the consequence of an intentional act is always modified by other factors, such as the doer, the intentions of the doer. Just let me give you an example. If I commit an unwholesome or negative act again and again without any remorse, then it will have more serious consequences than for a person who commits such a negative act only once and then tries not to commit again. So karma, or the law of karma, is not like a machine. That's important to understand. You probably noticed that I don't use the word sin. Instead of sin, I say negative action. And I do so because Buddhist ethics normally doesn't use the word sin, because the quality of an act is determined not by theoretical considerations or ethical considerations, but on the basis of the consequences of an act, whether it reduces suffering or not. And instead of sin, the Buddha speaks about unwholesome action or negative action, or to put it in another way, mistake, which simply means that you want to go to a specific direction. In this case, you want to avoid suffering, and in the long run you want to achieve Buddhahood, but you repeatedly commit actions which take you to the opposite direction. So this is what a mistake or an unwholesome act is. So it is the intention that defines the character or the nature of an act. And as an author, as the American author Jack Kornfield says in his book The Wise Heart, let me quote him here: "Suppose a man picks up a knife and plunges it into another man's body, causing his death. What kind of karma has he created? If the wielder of the knife is a skilled surgeon undertaking a risky procedure to relieve suffering, the karma is positive, even if the patient dies. But the same act done out of anger will produce the painful karma of murder." Let's talk about Buddhist meditation. So that's our next term, meditation. Meditation or bhavana is the practice of Buddhism, and you may say that almost all spiritual or religious systems have their techniques of meditation, which can be very different in terms of aims or tools or strategies. And I'm going to talk about Satipatthana in these few minutes. The word sati is translated as mindfulness, awareness, alertness, or collectedness. And the general idea behind sati is to try and keep the mind here and now, that is in the present moment. And this may sound easy for those who haven't tried it, but the everyday human mind doesn't operate like that. Everyday human mind tends to scatter, move around, focus on memories of the past, or projecting things to the future, which can be hopes or fears, and tries to avoid the present. So the Buddha, with a lot of emphasis, pointed out that those who are not present are dead, because a human being can act and can generate good karma to practice the Brahma Viharas or the divine abodes, to do something good, to move towards enlightenment only in the present. You can't do anything in the past or in the future, only in the present. So this is where the present is so important, and this is where freedom lies. Basic meditation practice is being aware of one's own breathing, every in-breath and out-breath. And breath is a very useful tool when it comes to meditation, because the practitioner, it's easier for the practitioner to stay in the here and now, to anchor in the body, so to say. And in the course of meditation, the practitioner may experience a wide range of physical and mental impressions, so it's emotions, memories from the past, or impacts from the external world. And the idea is to stay in the middle way and not to think that these impressions are obstacles to meditation, but try and integrate them into your satipatthana meditation. So you don't follow these impressions, but you don't suppress them either, but you are in the here and in the now, and try and focus on these impressions or events, mental events, as they are. The whole process is extremely interesting, because every meditation session is different from what you may expect. It's always different from the previous one. There is a formal way of meditation, which means that all the circumstances are set up in a specific manner that help you meditate. I mean, you are in a quiet room, you light a candle, you have a Buddha statue or an altar, possibly incense sticks, you have friends around, you are in the company of a teacher or fellow practitioners. So all these conditions help you meditate. But this is only a preparatory phase, so to say, because the main idea is that sati, or collectedness or mindfulness, should be practiced in every situation, regardless of any disturbing factor. And at this point, let me quote the Satipatthana Sutta, which is one of the most important speeches of the Buddha about Buddhist meditation. He says, "Furthermore, when going forward and returning, he makes himself fully alert, when looking toward and looking away, when bending and extending his limbs, when carrying his outer cloak, his upper robe and his bowl, when eating, drinking, chewing, savoring, urinating and defecating, when walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking and remaining silent, he makes himself fully alert." So you can see that practically every type, every kind of human action is listed here. And a frequent misunderstanding about meditation is that in such a state of meditation, people can't operate normally. They can't talk, they can't react normally. They just walk around like zombies, like lost in themselves. But this is a myth, this is not true, because sati opens up your external and internal world and helps you to function better, more smoothly, more efficiently, and with more care. Gunaratana, in his book Mindfulness in Plain English, dedicates a whole chapter to myths or misconceptions about meditation, and he gives a lengthy list about what meditation isn't. And he says that Satipatthana meditation or Vipassana meditation is not just a relaxation technique. It doesn't mean going into a trance. It's not a mysterious practice which cannot be understood by normal human beings. Its purpose is not to gain supernatural powers like read the mind of others. Meditation is not for the saints or sadhus or Buddhas, and also meditation doesn't mean that you are running away from reality. And the last myth he mentions is that meditation is selfish. I recommend his book very much to all those who are interested in Buddhist meditation, because as the title shows, Mindfulness in Plain English, it's very simple to understand. It uses a very simple English language, and it helps you to get a basic insight into Buddhist meditation practices. So meditation in Buddhism is a normal part of every human being a normal part of everyday life, and these human beings do not go into a trance, and they try and remain alert as much as possible, and they are not, as Gunaratana says, they are not running away from reality, but they are plunging into reality, gather objective information, learn from reality, and this information in turn will help them live a better life and help more of those around them. I say that meditation is for perfectly normal, perfectly regular people, but I would like to point out that it can be such a pleasant experience that the Buddha and his disciples who achieved enlightenment continue to practice Satipatthana even after they reached Nibbana. And at that point they have achieved everything, they had nothing to achieve, they had nowhere to go, but still they decided to stay and do this type of meditation, Satipatthana, or as they call it, peaceful abiding. So let's see what Nibbana is. That's our next term for today. Nibbana is a Pali word, and you probably know the Sanskrit word nirvana. It's a central concept of Buddhism, but quite ironically, it's impossible to define it, and not for some esoteric reasons, but simply because nirvana is beyond the scope of human experience that words can cover. Still, the Buddha tried to describe the concept of Nibbana with negation. So instead of, this is via negativa, so instead of saying what Nirvana is, the Buddha tried to say what Nirvana is not. And let me quote him here, cite him here. There is monks an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that emancipation from the born, become, made, fabricated would be the sound. So, unborn, unbecame, unmade, unfabricated. So, something which cannot be described within the normal frameworks of human experience. And when you read such a list of negations, you may be tempted to think that Nibbana is complete cessation, a sphere of non-existence where everything and everyone stops existing, everything extinguishes and dies out. And this is not true. Nibbana is by no means annihilation, but something quite different. And from a linguistic point of view, Nibbana is a very interesting word because you may give a very exact translation of Nibbana, which is extinction, by which we mean the dying out of a fire once the fuel is consumed. So the translation is 100% exact, but there is a problem that for those Indians who started to use the word Nibbana thousands of years ago and thousands of kilometers away from us, so the dying out of a fire quite differently. Because for us, when a fire dies out, it ceases to exist. So if I say extinction in English, then you may think that Nibbana is the complete cessation of being. It's a complete blackout, annihilation. But for Indians, for the ancient Indians, as Thanisaro pointed out in an article of his, the concept of extinction was quite different. Because for them, when the fire went out, it returned to its original, peaceful, natural existence, diffused throughout the cosmos. So instead of dying, it returned into its origins, into its natural state or mode of being. So This is why we always have to remind ourselves that Nibbana is by no means extinction or dying. And even though Nibbana lies beyond the duality of existence or non-existence, or object and subject, and every type of dual concepts, the Buddha used metaphors when he tried to convey his message about Nibbana. And let me read out some of these metaphors. These come from a book called The Island, and the authors are Ajahn Passano and Ajahn Amaro. So the Buddha says that Nibbana is at the end, the truth, the other shore, very hard to see, the everlasting, the undiversified, the deathless, in which doesn't mean immortality, mind you, but means the lack of birth and death, creation or destruction. Safety, purity, freedom, the island, the shelter, the harbor, and the beyond. And another frequent misunderstanding about Nibbana is that it is a location, a place, like a country or a domain, an actual place you can go to. And is opposite to samsara, that is conditioned everyday existence, or existence characterized by dukkha. And obviously, this is not true for Nibbana. Nibbana is not the opposite of samsara. Perhaps we could say that samsara and Nibbana are the two sides of the same coin, the only difference being in the mind of the human being who perceives it. So for an enlightened being like us, the world is samsara, while for an enlightened being like the Buddha, the same world is Nibbana. And the last term is Brahma-vihara. As you noticed, Buddhism is a very individual way where each human being has to reach enlightenment on his or her own, and although held by others, but no one can do it for her or him. Still, Buddhism lays a great emphasis on the ethical and beautiful way of coexisting with other beings, and these states of mind, mental setup or approaches are called the Brahma-viharas. Now, a literal translation of Brahma-vihara would be the divine abode, where divine means elevated or noble and has nothing to do with the concept of God of theistic systems. So this abode, this mental setup is divine because it's noble. The first Brahma-vihara is metta, which is often translated as love or loving kindness. And some may think, and I think that love seems to be a strong word, so perhaps it's worth considering that metta is a general attitude of friendliness or openness that does not exclude anyone or anything. Metta means that we are capable of letting go of our bitter feelings or resentments, and as Ajahn Sumedho ingeniously puts it, you don't need to like someone to be able to love them. The second Brahma-vihara is Karuna, or compassion, and this type of compassion has nothing to do with a hierarchy, where those who are on the top, those who have power and resources look down at those who don't. Compassion literally means feeling with. It comes from the Latin. That is sharing the sorrows of other beings. And compassion or karuna in this sense is empathy, simply, nothing more, empathy. And as you know, dukkha penetrates human life completely, and this can be a bit disheartening perspective at the first glance. But if you look around and you see that all beings around you are experiencing the very same dukkha, you may feel that karuna that compassion for them and for yourself, and you may understand that dukkha is a bond which connects all beings. As a contemporary teacher puts it, we are brothers and sisters in suffering. The third Brahma-vihara is mudita, and it's closely linked to karuna. It's a sympathy or compassion again, but in this case, it's the ability to share the joy of others. So not the suffering of others like karuna, but the joy of others, to have the ability to enjoy the beauty and truth in others without jealousy or bitterness or envy, which, as Ajahn Sumedho pointed out, can sometimes be more difficult than karuna. And the fourth one is upekha, which is often mistranslated as indifference. But upekha is not indifference, but equanimity or serenity, because this is the factor which counterbalances the three other Brahma-viharas and help you retain your inner balance. And of course, if you want to help others, if you want to share the feelings, the sadness and the joys of others, then you will need this type of balance. If you want to help with intelligence and feeling, then you will definitely need upekha as well. And to finish my presentation and to show the beauty of Brahma-viharas and to illustrate the importance of a positive, loving attitude in Theravada Buddhism, let me cite the Karaniya Metta Sutta. It is in Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli's translation. This part of the sutta describes the thoughts of the practitioner, the thoughts of a monk who is doing this meditation practice. In safety and in bliss may creatures all be of a blissful heart. Whatever breathing beings there may be, no matter whether they are frail or firm, with none excepted, be they long or big or middle-sized, or be they short or small or thick, as well as those seen or unseen, or whether they are dwelling far or near, existing or yet seeking to exist. May creatures all be of a blissful heart. Let no one work another one's undoing, or even slight him at all everywhere, and never let them wish each other ill through provocation or resentful thought. And just as might a mother with her life protect the son that was her only child, so let him then for every living thing maintain unbounded consciousness in being, and let him too with love for all the world maintain unbounded consciousness in being, above, below, and all round in between, untroubled, with no enemy or foe. So this marks the end of my presentation, and I hope I could give you some insight into the basic teachings of Theravada Buddhism, the basic terms of Theravada Buddhism, and I think that understanding these terms and concepts marks the beginning of a very interesting path.